Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Monsters Manifested, right here on DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode, we're going to be continuing our trek through the devil monster type with the Bearded Devil. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. The Bearded Devil's stat block can be found on page 70 of the Monster Manual, and its lore can be found on page 68. So, let's begin there. Bearded Devil, also known as Barbazu. Bearded Devils serve archdevils as shock troops, fighting shoulder to shoulder and reveling in the glory of battle. They respond with violence to any slight, real or imagined, gorging themselves on violence as their infernal saw-toothed glaives carve a path through their foes. A bearded devil is humanoid in form, with pointed ears, scaly skin, a long tail, and claws that clearly show its fiendish nature. These devils take their names from the snake-like groats that adorn their chins, which they use to lash and poison enemies, weakening them with their virulent venom. And that's all there is when it comes to the Bearded Devil. Once again, fairly concise, short and sweet, but I think that it does provide us with a bit of information in regards to the disposition of the Bearded Devil and how they would behave in a given scenario. So I think that with all that said, we will still be able to come up with some ideas for how to implement them in an adventure for the players at our table. But before we get into all that, let's move on to the stat block. The Bearded Devil is a medium fiend, devil, with a lawful evil alignment. It has an armor class of 13, which is natural armor, hit points that average 52, or 8d8 plus 16, and it has a movement speed of 30 feet. The Bearded Devil has a strength of 16, a dexterity of 15, a constitution of 15, an intelligence of 9, a wisdom of 11, and a charisma of 11. Its saving throws include strength plus 5, constitution plus 4, and wisdom plus 2. The Bearded Devil is resistant to the damage types of cold, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing from non-magical weapons that are not silvered, and it is immune to the damage types of fire and poison, as well as immune to the poisoned condition. It has the senses of dark vision for 120 feet and a passive perception of 10. The Bearded Devil speaks the languages of Infernal and Telepathy for 120 feet and is a challenge rating of 3. Onto the abilities. Devil's Sight. Magical darkness does not impede the Devil's dark vision. Magic Resistance. The Devil has advantage on saving throws against spells and other magical effects. And Steadfast. The devil can't be frightened while it can see an allied creature within 30 feet of it. On to the actions. Multi-attack. The devil makes 2 attacks, one with its beard and one with its glaive. Beard is a melee weapon attack with a +5 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one creature. On a hit, it does an average of 6 or 1d8 plus 2 piercing damage, and the target must succeed on a DC 12 Constitution saving throw or be poisoned for 1 minute. While poisoned in this way, the target cannot regain hit points. The target can repeat the saving throw at the end of each of its turns, ending the effect on itself on a success. Glaive. Also a melee weapon attack with a +5 to hit, a reach of 10 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 8 or 1d10 plus 3 slashing damage. If the target is a creature other than an undead or a construct, it must succeed on a DC 12 Constitution saving throw or lose an average of 5 or 1d10 hit points at the start of each of its turns due to an infernal wound. Each time the devil hits the wounded target with this attack, the damage dealt by the wound increases by an average of 5 or 1d10. Any creature can take an action to staunch the wound with a successful DC 12 Wisdom medicine check. The wound also closes if the target receives magical healing. And that's all there is when it comes to the stats for the Bearded Devil. So all in all, a relatively simple stat block to work with and implement and utilize when using the Bearded Devil in combat. Fairly interesting that the Bearded Devil does not have too much in the way of varied attacks and stuff like that. However, both of its attacks do activate certain debuffs and or effects that seem to be of more significant detriment to its opponents, let's say. But that does give me some ideas on how to utilize a bearded devil contextually in an adventure alongside the rather concise and short description of it provided to us in its lore. So with all that said and done, let's move on to some adventure crafting, shall we? Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind for me in terms of developing an adventure when considering the bearded devil as the monster of choice is something to the effect of a shrouded, mysterious, combative individual. Maybe even someone or something that is kind of rumored to exist, is perceived more as legend or folklore than reality, in that the bearded devil seeks out individuals of high regard or repute and possibly challenges them to single combat, one-on-one type thing, due to the fact that bearded devils appear to adore the sort of bloodlust that enthralls them when they see or go into battle. Right? So imagine, if you would, the players are in a town or in a city, or perhaps throughout their travels between different settlements, they have heard rumors of a sort of cloaked or shrouded individual that apparently presents themselves to individuals of high infamy or fame or notoriety in terms of being powerful warriors. So you could have something like the top soldier in the Royal Guard. You could have perhaps the most successful and dominant gladiator or combatant in arena battles. You could have something to the effect of perhaps highly notable individuals, bounty hunters or assassins or something like that. And the party can stumble upon the corpse or the body of one of these individuals. And perhaps that can lead to even something like a mysterious detective adventure where the party have to take efforts to clear their name as they were discovered standing atop the body, let's say, of this well-received, notable warrior. Perhaps even the party is new to this town when they stumble across this individual, maybe in an alleyway or something like that, and the guard spots them and sees them standing around this body crumpled up on the floor and immediately jumps to the conclusion that they were the ones who murdered them. And so now the party has to make efforts to clear their name and prove who it was that in fact killed this reputable individual, right? And then you have this instance where the players are making efforts to find clues or more information, perhaps investigate some location that has long been abandoned or forgotten about. You know, you could have the party have to travel out into the outskirts of town, maybe into the woods or into a cave or something of that nature where the bearded devil resides, and they have to confront the bearded devil and presumably battle it, as a bearded devil does not seem the type to negotiate or be willing to compromise in any way, shape, or form. And you could even implement something like an NPC that follows them along their journey and maybe investigates them and what they're doing while they're doing it. And the objective would not only be to confront and defeat the bearded devil, but to also keep the NPC guard alive so that they can report back and there's a reputable voice within the Royal Guard or what have you to say, yeah, no, it wasn't these people. In fact, it was this devil of sorts who's been roaming around searching for these highly regarded combatants and warriors and individuals and has been challenging them to combat, right? And then you could even present a little reward there at the end of that encounter where after the players defeat the bearded devil, they may find its treasure cache, and within its treasure cache, or perhaps part of the main chamber that the bearded devil resides in, there's in effect a sort of wall of trophies or something like that that the bearded devil has collected from all of the individuals that it's managed to defeat. You could also implement this sort of shrouded challenger situation throughout a campaign or a series of adventures where, as I mentioned before, this individual is something more of a myth or legend, kind of folkloric, but everywhere the players go, every city, every town, every settlement, there's word of this cloaked figure that will approach notable warriors and challenge them to combat, to a battle of the death of sorts. And you can string that along into multiple adventures, which can then lead to a climactic apex ending where the players find its dwelling, manage to encounter it and battle it and overcome the bearded devil, and then reap the rewards of what have you, perhaps notoriety for themselves, perhaps the treasures that the bearded devil has accrued over its time, those trophies as previously mentioned, and perhaps some new doors open up to them, both beneficial and detrimental. Another way that you could utilize a bearded devil would be similar in the sense that it's sort of legendary or mythical, but in the way of a sort of spirit of combat. So you could present a bearded devil as a creature that manifests itself as soon as or whenever there is a conflict or a battle about to take place, taking place, or shortly after it has taken place. So you could present a scenario where your players are in the midst of perhaps a territorial siege or an encroachment of a warlord of sorts. Perhaps there's some sort of large battle taking place for some form of divine birthright to a location, or perhaps to some sort of ancient relic. And as this conflict grows and they're at the front lines of this battle, or that perhaps there's more and more chaos and destruction taking place, a bearded devil or multiple bearded devils start to reveal themselves and present themselves on the material plane, sort of jumping into the fray and just causing as much chaos and havoc as they can within the battlefield, because that's sort of what they feed off of. You know, anywhere that they can sense or smell or even taste the battle, the violence in the air, they are compelled to present themselves and engage the combat as a sort of interested third party, regardless of the reasonings or the sides that may be in conflict with each other. They don't really care. They're just there to lay waste to whatever is around. And the reasoning for that is very simple, or can be very simple rather, in that perhaps the more individuals that they can cut down on the material plane, the more souls they can then lay claim to and bring into the nine hells to expand the armies of these devils. You could also utilize that idea as part of the previously mentioned shrouded combatant idea, where perhaps they sign a deal with these notable warriors before the battle takes place, or even it's just a verbal agreement and the combat takes place and the bearded devil succeeds. So that's their way of farming souls, if you would, to bring into the nine hells for their masters. You could also utilize the bearded devil in a larger scale by using multiple bearded devils as something to the effect of shock troops for some sort of ruler's army. So let's go back to the instance I was describing of perhaps the bearded devils as sort of the spirit of combat show up when there is a turf war of sorts, or some sort of tyrannical warlord that is encroaching upon the lands of the royal kingdom or what have you. You could have an instance where this tyrant, in fact, decided to strike a deal with a devil, an archdevil, or another higher ranked devil to be successful in their conquests for territory, superiority, collection of powerful relics or antiquities, anything like that. And in exchange for their soul, they were granted a small army or a small platoon of bearded devils. And so the bearded devils behave as these like shock troopers and kind of lay waste to anyone that goes up against them because of their infernal capabilities and their resistance to conventional weaponry, right, and damage types. Not to mention the level of efficacy that they would have, these bearded devils, against common guards or soldiers because of the nature of their attacks and how they can poison their opponents with their beard whips, how they can use their glaive to create these sort of infernal wounds that constantly do damage over time, and if struck again, that damage stacks. So you can see a very effective combatant that can sort of just cut down all of their opponents, especially if their opponents are more of a common mass of individuals rather than highly skilled or having some form of expertise in strategy or a combat style or defense against certain types of weaponry. So you could generate a situation where the party is charged by perhaps the head of the guard or perhaps the general of the royal army, what have you, into contending with this squad of bearded devil shock troopers that have just managed to carve way through all of the army's defenses. And because of this sort of ragtag nature of the party, presumably, they think that, this might not be ideal and you guys might not succeed necessarily, but you're something different from our typical plate armor, sword and board soldiers that the bearded devils have become accustomed to. So perhaps a change in pace will be enough to give the bearded devils pause or a moment of misstep where you can overcome them and stop this from taking place. And you can develop something much larger with that, where perhaps this warlord is expanding in multiple directions, or perhaps there's just word of it beginning wherever your players are starting off. And as they progress through the campaign and into these different areas that you present to them, there's more and more of an influence of this tyrant sort of laying claim to everything. You can have small villages or towns that are just sort of in desperate straits and they're struggling to survive and make it through life with the changes that are taking place. Perhaps there's a town that's entirely occupied by these bearded devil shock troopers, and that can be your party's first exposure to them before moving on to the sort of front lines or into the middle of the no-go zone, as it were, and they can see the sort of stranglehold that this warlord tyrant has over the lands by use of these bearded devils to just enforce and extort and coerce the wills of the common folk in order to lay claim to everything that is around them. All in all, though, I do think that the bearded devil is a pretty cool monster. Not very much for us to work with and extrapolate from in terms of creating many sort of wide overarching instances that sort of highlight the bearded devil in a long tail fashion. But I do feel that the bearded devil is a good monster to use for instances like that where it's kind of combat heavy and you want to throw a little curveball at your players in terms of the combat mechanics, where if the bearded devil gets a hit on them, all it takes is one hit and the bearded devil can attack twice in a turn with its multi-attack ability. So all it takes is one hit and they get a bit of damage and an effect that can cause some serious trouble for them down the line if they don't get it taken care of pretty quick and if they don't have a magical healer to help them out on their journey. But that's all I got for you fine folks today when it comes to the bearded devil and how we may be able to implement it in some adventures or scenarios for your players. I'd like to thank you all very much for tuning in. I highly appreciate it. On next week's episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering the Bone Devil, which should be a pretty interesting creature to work with and figure out what we can create. But until then, I'd kindly ask that you like the podcast, follow the podcast, rate the podcast, leave a comment, share the podcast wherever you can, wherever you want, as I would highly appreciate it and help me out, help the podcast grow, and help the podcast get to more ears, to more people that may be curious or interested in developing some scenarios or adventures, some ideas for their next D&D session or any other tabletop RPG session. If you're listening to this episode of Monsters Manifested on YouTube, I'd kindly ask that you like, comment, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all those magic buttons that do things, as it would help me out, help the channel out, help the podcast out, help everything grow a bit bigger. Once again, as I mentioned, get to the ears of more people and perhaps help out some up-and-coming, budding dungeon masters and game masters, or assist in some more seasoned DMs and GMs that are having some trouble with getting their creativity flowing when it comes to a specific monster. But once again, Thank you all very much for tuning in. I'm MaxMcCool, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a good day, everyone.